The pen was already in my hand when the alien delegate across the glass table raised a sharp, silver claw and halted the entire ceremony. Every broadcast camera in the hall zoomed in on him. My heart slammed against my ribs. 6 years of brutal interplanetary war, 400 million lives lost across both sides, and now this creature was trying to rewrite the terms at the very last second. Right before the ink touched the digital pad. My name is Ethan Hale. I wasn't a general, nor was I a frontline grunt. I was a chief defense engineer who had been dragged into the peace delegation for one simple reason: I knew weapons systems inside and out. And I knew how to read the bureaucratic fine print that nobody else cared to decipher. Standing in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Vane Species Home Orbital Station, I felt the crushing weight of billions of human eyes watching me through their screens. Praying the war wouldn't reignite over a single clause. The alien speaking was named Threll, the lead negotiator for the Vane. He stood 7 feet tall, with polished silver-gray skin and translucent eyes that never seemed to blink. He tapped his claw against the glowing blue projection of the treaty document floating between us. There is an unacceptable ambiguity here, Threll declared, his chess translator translating his clicks into a flat, synthetic voice. Clause 40 states that humanity agrees to deploy no advanced weapons along the sovereign border garrisons. However, the document fails to define what constitutes advanced. The entire assembly fell dead quiet. The soft, rhythmic hum of the station's environmental scrubbers suddenly felt deafening. Beside me, Colonel Owen Hart shifted his weight. Hart had commanded 3 battle fleets during the war. His jaw was clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. He wasn't a man accustomed to standing idly while an alien bureaucrat dictated terms. I took a step forward before Hart could lose his temper. Define it however you like, I said, keeping my tone steady and even. We already agreed to the spirit of the restriction. No directed energy cannons, no plasma repeaters, no kinetic railguns, no orbital strike platforms, and no powered exoskeleton suits with lethal targeting packages. That is what advanced means to us. If your council wishes to explicitly list those restrictions, add them now. But we are not walking away from this table today. Threll locked his unblinking gaze onto mine for an excruciatingly long moment. I knew if he rejected this, 6 years of bloody stalemate would bleed into a 7th, an 8th, and on until one of our species simply ran out of young men and women to burn in the void. Slowly, Threll lowered his arm. Agreed, he hummed. No advanced weapons, categorized explicitly by technology class. This definition shall be recorded verbatim. A collective exhale swept across the human delegation. Behind me, I heard a young aide whisper a quiet, trembling phrase, "Thank God." I signed the document. Threll signed immediately after. The war was officially over. But I need to be completely honest with you, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense if I am. In that moment, while the ink was still drying, I wasn't feeling relieved about peace. I was obsessing over the exact phrase Threll had insisted upon, technology class. The Vane were a high-tech species through and through. They had fought us for 6 years using particle beam cannons, automated drone swarms, and hard-light barrier shields. To them, war was a linear ladder of technological hardware. In their minds, a weapon's deadliness was directly tied to its power grid and microcircuitry. Strip away the microchips, and you stripped away the threat. What they didn't realize was that they had skipped steps in their own history. The Vane had invented their first atmospheric flying craft and their first directed energy weapon within the same 50-year span. They had completely bypassed thousands of years of primitive warfare. They had never spent millennia figuring out brutal, mechanical ways to kill one another using raw physics, lever action, and sharpened steel long before anyone learned to harness electricity. I didn't utter a word of this. I shook Threll's cold silver hand, gave him a practiced diplomat smile, and walked out of that grand hall with a 500-year-old blueprint already reforming in my mind. That night, aboard the transport cruiser taking us back to Earth space, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the empty mess hall with a cup of cold, bitter black coffee, filling a digital sketchpad with vector calculations. Around 2 in the morning, Colonel Hart walked in, still wearing his full dress uniform. He leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the drawing floating on my screen. "Is that a crossbow, Ethan?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "It's a high-tension projectile firing system," I corrected calmly. "Fully compliant with Clause 40. Hart sat down across from me, his expression darkening with suspicion. "Ethan, we just signed a peace treaty." "We did," I said, turning the pad toward him. "And it strictly forbids advanced technology. It says absolutely nothing about primitive mechanics." Hart stared at the schematic, turning the concept over in his head. Then, slowly, I watched his eyes widen as the realization struck him. A cold, dangerous grin spread across the old soldier's face. "They wrote the treaty, didn't they?" Hart whispered. "They wrote the treaty," I confirmed. "They defined the terms. And now, we're going to build something they never saw coming." Colonel Hart leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his calloused jaw as he stared out the observation window. Outside, hyperspace starlight stretched into brilliant white ribbons. "You realize," Hart said, his voice dropping an octave, "that if this actually works, and the Vane figure out how we played them, they are going to be absolutely furious." "They signed it in front of representatives from 7 galactic nations," I replied flatly. "They insisted on the wording. If they get angry because we followed their explicit legal definition to the letter, that's a diplomatic issue. Not a military one. It's going to be a military issue if those border outposts can't defend themselves," Hart argued, leaning forward again and tapping the digital blueprint on my screen. "Look at this draw weight calculation, Ethan. This wouldn't even dent a standard Vane infantry unit. Their soldiers wear kinetic deflection fields and automated energy shielding. A piece of wood and steel isn't going to break through hard-light defense barriers. A standard kinetic shield is tuned to stop high-velocity, low-mass rounds," I explained, pulling up a secondary simulation. "A railgun slug travels at Mach 7. When a Vane shield detects an object moving at that speed, the internal sensors register the kinetic threshold instantly and project a counter-frequency barrier to absorb the impact. But what happens when an object moves at only 300 feet per second? Heavy mass, slow velocity, zero energy signature, zero microchip telemetry." Hart frowned, leaning closer to the physics model floating between us. "The sensor doesn't register it as an incoming weapon projectile." "Exactly," I grinned. "The shield's automated logic assumes a slow-moving object is just space debris, low-grade atmospheric dust, or a harmless environmental object. The barrier doesn't even trigger. The bolt passes straight through the energy field before the infantryman even realizes he's under attack." Hart went completely quiet. He was evaluating the tactical math the way a career officer does, weighing operational risk against strategic advantage. "It's almost absurd," Hart muttered softly. "Humanity spent 10,000 years killing each other with bowstrings, catapults, and steel blades before we ever discovered electromagnetism. Every trick, every brutal mechanical design, every lesson about how to leverage simple mass and tension, we mastered it centuries ago. We just stopped using it because we built fancier toys. We didn't forget how to make them," I said quietly. "We just put them in museums." Hart slid the digital tablet back to me. "I want a full engineering proposal, material estimates, and a manufacturing timeline on my desk before we dock at Sol Station. If we're doing this, it has to be kept under total operational security. The Vane High Command won't hesitate to launch a preemptive strike if they think we're secretly rearming. Within 72 hours of landing." I had established a covert design group inside a decommissioned Starship maintenance yard orbiting Mars. We officially registered our operation under Defense Budget Code Project Heritage, officially designated as an historical preservation initiative aimed at restoring ancient human weaponry for educational displays. It was a cover story so painfully dull that no interspecies trade auditor ever bothered to request an audit. My lead ordnance officer was Major Grace Whitfield, a brilliant engineer who had spent 3 years during the war trying to crack the Vance energy shield algorithms. When I first handed her the schematics for our modernized crossbow, she stared at the screen for 3 full minutes without blinking. "You want me to equip our frontline border garrisons with longbows and ballistas?" she asked, looking up at me like I had lost my mind. "Not historical longbows, Grace," I said, walking her over to the primary fabrication bench. "I want to build a longbow constructed from carbon nanotube weave, reinforced with aircraft-grade titanium alloys, and engineered using computer-modeled limb curvature calculations. No microchips, no power cells, no targeting lasers. Just pure, unadulterated mechanical efficiency." Grace flipped through the structural stress files, her initial skepticism slowly giving way to intense technical curiosity. "The Vance electronic jamming fields overwrite guided targeting systems across a 5-mile radius," she mused out loud. "Their specialized ECM nodes render every smart munition in our current arsenal completely blind. And what does a jamming field do to a mechanical lever tensioned by a spring steel assembly?" I asked. Grace let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "Absolutely nothing. Gravity and kinetic momentum don't care about signal jamming." She pulled out her stylus and immediately began tweaking my draw tension variables. "If we adjust the limb sweep by 4 degrees, we can increase the velocity without compromising structural integrity." "But Ethan, we still need to prove this works against actual vein armor plating." 2 weeks later, we had constructed our first prototype, a heavy, shoulder-mounted repeating crossbow forged from blackened carbon alloy. We set up our firing test inside a pressurized cargo bay deep within the facility. Mounted 80 yards away was an authentic piece of Vane heavy infantry shield plating, salvaged from a destroyed cruiser during the Siege of Orion. Grace activated the shield panel. A brilliant, translucent blue grid of hardlight energy shimmered into existence, humming with lethal power. I stepped up to the line, rested the heavy carbon alloy stock against my shoulder, aligned the iron sights, and squeezed the mechanical release trigger. Thwack! The mechanical twang echoed off the cold steel walls of the bay. The heavy tungsten-tipped bolt streaked across the room at 350 feet per second. The Vane shield didn't flicker. It didn't hum. It didn't react at all. The bolt passed straight through the blue energy barrier as if it were thin air, striking the reinforced alloy plate behind it with a deafening crack that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. The cargo bay went dead silent. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. We all stared at the target. The tungsten bolt was buried 4 inches deep into the center of the Vane armor plate, cold smoke drifting upward from the impact point. Grace gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Then, the entire room erupted into wild, screaming cheers. Engineers were shouting, hugging, and slamming their fists against the workbenches. I walked down the firing line, stopped in front of the target, and ran my finger over the shattered metal edges. The loophole wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was lethal. 3 months later, a heavily shielded transport vessel slipped quietly out of Earth dry docks, carrying 200 unmarked wooden crates. The manifest officially listed the cargo as agricultural machinery and civil surveying gear bound for Outpost 7, a bleak, windswept border colony sitting less than 200 kilometers from the newly established Vane demarcation line. I traveled alongside the shipment personally, accompanied by Grace Whitfield and a small technical team. I wanted to be on the ground when the frontier garrison saw what command had sent them to replace their confiscated plasma rifles. When our shuttle touched down on the cracked concrete landing pad of Outpost 7, the desert wind was howling, whipping crimson dust across the airfield. Standing waiting for us was Captain Ava Bishop, a battle-hardened infantry officer with a severe scar running down the left side of her jawline. Bishop watched as my crew unloaded the first heavy crate. She stepped up, jammed a crowbar beneath the wooden lid, and popped the nails with a loud crack. She stared down into the crate for a long, silent moment. I waited for her to laugh, or throw a punch, or call for an immediate court-martial. Instead, she slowly reached down and lifted out a dark, matte black compound bow, turning the sleek carbon fiber frame over in her gloved hands. "Hail," Bishop said, her voice dripping with ice. "I have 40 combat veterans under my command sitting right on the doorstep of a vein armored division. And you just brought me a box of oversized toys." "Those aren't toys, Captain," I replied calmly, adjusting my dust jacket against the biting wind. "They're the most lethal mechanical weapons ever manufactured. They're sticks and string." Bishop barked, slamming the bow back into the crate. I asked Earth Command for heavy artillery replacement units. The Vane have armored skimmers patrolling the border ridge every 6 hours. If a rogue squad decides to breach our perimeter, what am I supposed to do? Shoot them with an arrow and hope they die of irony? By now, a crowd of garrison soldiers had gathered around the shuttle ramp. They were lean, tired men and women who had spent years fighting in the trenches of the outer rim. As they peered into the open crates and realized there were no pulse rifles, no plasma sidearms, and no micromissile launchers, a murmur of anger swept through the ranks. A broad-shouldered sergeant named Bennett stepped forward, crossing his thick arms over his chest. "Is this a sick joke, sir? Command signed away our guns and gave us Robin Hood gear." "It's no joke, Sergeant," Gray stepped in, holding a sleek black repeating crossbow. "And if you give us 45 minutes on the firing range, we will prove to every single person here that this shipment will save your lives." Captain Bishop glared at me. Her eyes narrow and skeptical. 45 minutes, Hale. If you can't convince my troops, I'm packing you back onto that shuttle and sending a formal grievance directly to the Joint Chiefs. We set up the demonstration range at the far perimeter of the outpost, mounting 3 salvaged Vane infantry energy shields onto steel test frames 80 yards out. The garrison troops lined up along the safety barrier, their arms crossed, whispering mockingly among themselves. They were modern soldiers, their entire operational philosophy was built around battery charges, heat sinks, laser sights, and plasma yields. To them, anything without a power cell was obsolete garbage. I stepped onto the firing line, shouldering a carbon titanium repeating crossbow. Beside me, Gray stood ready with a heavy mechanical tension catapult mounted on a tripod frame. "Sergeant Bennett." I called out over the howling desert wind. "Power up those Vane shield barriers to maximum output." Bennett walked down the line, flicking the manual overrides on the 3 shield generators. A blinding wall of blue hardlight flared to life, humming with enough electric potential to vaporize a soldier on contact. "Target lock verified." Bennett yelled back, stepping behind the protective bunker. "Those barriers are running at standard frontline military spec. A standard kinetic round would disintegrate on impact. Watch closely." I shouted to the gathered garrison. I took a deep breath, brought the iron sights up to eye level, aligned the reticle with the center of the middle shield, and pulled the mechanical trigger. Clang! The heavy limb snapped forward with incredible force. The tungsten core bolt blurred through the air. It hit the hardlight shield square in the center. The energy barrier didn't even ripple. The bolt passed straight through the glowing blue light as if it were smoke, smashing through the center of the steel target frame behind it and tearing a hole clean through the quarter-inch armor plate. The mocking whispers along the safety barrier instantly died. Captain Bishop didn't say a word. She stepped out from behind the command line and walked slowly down the range toward the target frame. The desert wind whipped her hair as she reached out, running her gloved fingers over the clean, punctured hole in the metal. She turned back toward us, her eyes wide with total shock. "Do it again," Bishop ordered softly. "Reload and shoot the left target." I pulled the mechanical lever back, snapping another bolt into the firing chamber, raised the stock, and fired. Thwack! Once again, the bolt bypassed the Vane shield completely, punching a hole straight through the steel target. Grace immediately unlocked the tripod on her heavy mechanical catapult. Using a manual hand crank, she tensioned the twin alloy torsion bars, loaded a 10-pound solid steel ball into the leather sling, and pulled the mechanical release pin. Whoosh! The heavy steel sphere arced high into the dusty sky, completely ignoring the outpost's active radar jamming field, before slamming down with terrifying force directly onto the third target frame, crushing the Vane shield generator beneath hundreds of pounds of raw kinetic impact. Silence settled over the range. The garrison soldiers stared at the destroyed targets, then at the mechanical weapons in our hands. Sergeant Bennett walked over to the broken shield frame, picked up the twisted piece of pierced armor, and held it up to the sun. "No power supply," Bennett whispered, his voice trembling with newfound awe. "No guidance microchips. No electronic signature for their sensors to track. Just math, tension, and gravity," Grace said with a confident smile. "And not a single jammer in this galaxy can disable the laws of physics." Captain Bishop walked back to where I was standing. She looked down at the carbon fiber crossbow in my hands, then looked out toward the dark, jagged mountain ridge that marked the Vane border. "How fast can you train my people to use these?" Bishop asked. 2 days for basic proficiency," I answered. "A week for full tactical integration." Bishop turned to face her garrison. "Sergeant Bennett. Grab 3 squads and start unloading every single crate off that shuttle. I want every guard post on the perimeter wall fully equipped by midnight." For the next 3 weeks, Outpost 7 was transformed into an ancient archer's proving ground powered by modern engineering. From dawn until dusk, the sounds of mechanical cranks, snapping bowstrings, and heavy tungsten bolts thudding into target blocks filled the air. Veterans who had spent their entire careers learning how to manage plasma weapon heat dispersion were now mastering draw weights, arrow trajectories, wind correction factors, and mechanical lever ratios. Sergeant Bennett had become our biggest champion. He spent 6 hours a day drilling his squad on rapid reload techniques using the repeating crossbows. "It's all in the hip pivot," Bennett shouted to a group of young recruits on the northern wall, demonstrating the smooth lever action cocking motion. "You don't need to wait for a battery to recycle. You pull the lever, index the chamber, sight your target, and release. Keep your cadence steady." Standing on the high observation wall beside Captain Bishop, I watched the garrison work. The initial frustration had completely vanished, replaced by an intense, disciplined focus. Humans are, at their core, toolmakers. Give us a piece of steel and a mechanical problem, and we will find a way to make it lethal. Our long-range sensor array picked up unusual activity along Sector 4 last night, Bishop noted, looking out over the desert through her binoculars. Unidentified skimmer signatures operating without diplomatic transponders. "Vane military patrols?" I asked. "No," Bishop shook her head. "Vane regular forces wouldn't dare violate the treaty so publicly this early. We think it's a splinter group, a rogue paramilitary faction known as the Karen Remnant. They're hardline Vane veterans who refuse to accept the peace accord. They've been raiding supply lines along the frontier, testing whether human garrisons have the firepower to defend themselves under the new treaty restrictions." Grace walked up the wall stairs, holding 2 steaming mugs of rehydrated coffee. She handed one to me and leaned against the steel railing. "If the Karen Remnant raids this post," Grace said, "they're going to come in expecting an easy kill. Vane intelligence knows we signed Clause 40. They know we stripped our heavy cannons." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Bishop replied coldly. "The test came sooner than any of us anticipated." At 3 o'clock the following morning, the outpost's perimeter alarms didn't sound, because the incoming enemy had deployed a high-frequency sensor blackout field. Instead, the warning came from a visual lookout posted on the eastern wall. A sharp flare of crimson light cut through the pitch-black desert night as an explosive charge detonated against the outer security fence. Sirens instantly blared across the base. I bolted out of my bunk, pulling my tactical jacket over my shirt, and ran alongside Grace toward the eastern ramparts. The night air was freezing, filled with the smell of ozone and burning synthetic wire. Down below, 3 sleek, dark-armored Vane assault skimmers had glided quietly over the sand ridges, landing just 200 yards outside the perimeter wire. Dozens of heavily armored Karen raiders were disembarking, their high-intensity hardlight shields glowing bright violet in the dark. They carried high-output plasma carbines, moving in tight, confident tactical squads toward the breached fence. They were moving fast, clearly expecting our troops to be huddled inside the command bunker, helpless without high-tech energy weapons to fight back. Captain Bishop was already on the eastern rampart, her face illuminated by the flickering light of the distant fires. "Hold your fire," Bishop commanded over the tactical comms channel, her voice steady as steel. "Let them pass the 60-yard marker. I want them completely caught in the open." Sergeant Bennett's squad was kneeling behind the fortified stone parapet, 20 soldiers holding carbon fiber repeating crossbows. Their bolts notched and ready. On the upper tower, Grace's catapult crew was making micro-adjustments to the manual elevation gears on 2 heavy-tension ballistas. The Vane raiders advanced confidently. Their squad leader raised a plasma carbine and fired a brilliant blue energy bolt at the outpost wall, scorching the reinforced concrete. "They're at 50 yards. Bennett called out quietly. "They're raising squad deflection barriers." The Vane soldiers overlapped their hardlight shields, forming an impenetrable glowing wall of energy meant to deflect standard heavy kinetic rounds and laser fire. They believed they were completely invulnerable. Captain Bishop raised her hand, waited for 3 agonizing seconds, and then snapped her arm down. "All positions. Engage." A sound echoed across the desert floor that no military force in the galaxy had heard on a battlefield for hundreds of years. It wasn't the deafening roar of plasma cannons or the high-pitched screech of railguns. It was a sharp, collective, metallic thwack as 20 heavy bowstrings released simultaneously. 20 tungsten-tipped bolts cut through the freezing night air at 400 feet per second. The Karen raiders didn't even attempt to dodge. They held their glowing hardlight shield wall firm, fully expecting the incoming projectiles to bounce off their energy barriers like harmless hail. Instead, the heavy bolts ripped clean through the violet light barriers without losing a fraction of their momentum. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. The heavy tungsten tips shattered armor plates, piercing through shoulder pads and chest pieces. The Vane shield wall collapsed in a second as 5 frontline raiders crumpled to the dirt, screeching in utter shock and confusion. "Reload!" Bennett roared. "Keep the pressure on." The human squad executed their drilled cocking motion in perfect synchronization. The mechanical levers clicked back, fresh bolts dropped into the firing channels, and within 3 seconds, another lethal volley rained down from the wall. Thwack thwack thwack. The raiders' tactical formation broke apart into complete chaos. They had spent their entire lives training to fight within the strict rules of energy-based warfare. When an enemy fired a weapon, their sensors were supposed to ping an incoming thermal warning, allowing automated systems to angle shields and deploy countermeasures. These incoming weapons produced no thermal signature, no electronic warning, and no energy pulse. To the Vane raiders, it felt as though invisible, lethal spikes were raining down from the heavens itself. "What is this?" a Vane officer screamed over an unencrypted radio channel, his voice panicked and frantic. "They're bypassing our hardlight barriers. Our shields are useless. Fall back to the skimmers. Grace. Hit their extraction line." Captain Bishop ordered into her comms unit. On the high tower, Grace pulled the mechanical release pin on the heavy ballista. Crack. A massive, 6-foot steel-reinforced bolt, launched by 2 massive alloy torsion arms, hurtled through the night sky. It slammed directly into the engine housing of the lead Vane skimmer 300 yards away. The sheer mechanical force tore through the anti-gravity engine, causing the vehicle's reactor frame to buckle under the raw physical impact. The skimmer skidded sideways across the sand, erupting into a localized firestorm. Panicked, the remaining raiders scattered across the dunes, abandoning their fallen gear and sprinting blindly toward their two remaining craft. They weren't retreating in a disciplined tactical formation, they were running in absolute, blind terror from an enemy using weapons their minds couldn't comprehend. The two remaining skimmers slammed their thrusters into overdrive, kicking up massive clouds of crimson sand as they fled wildly back across the border line, disappearing into the dark mountains. Silence returned to Outpost 7. The whole engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. Along the eastern rampart, not a single human soldier had been wounded. The air smelled not of spent laser cartridges, but of cold dust and mechanical oil. Sergeant Bennett lowered his repeating crossbow, staring out at the burning skimmer in the distance. He slowly turned to look at me, his eyes wide with wild, adrenaline-fueled disbelief. "Hail," Bennett breathed out, a slow, hysterical laugh escaping his chest. "I am never, ever going to make fun of sticks and string again." Captain Bishop walked along the wall, checking her troops. She looked down at the desert floor where the abandoned vein weapons and shattered shield generators lay scattered in the dirt. "Get a recovery team out there," Bishop ordered quietly. "I want every piece of abandoned enemy gear documented and catalogued. And make sure our comms team prepares an unencrypted battle report." "Unencrypted, Captain?" Grace asked, wiping grease from her cheek. Bishop looked up at the stars, a cold, sharp smile playing across her lips. "I want the Vane High Command to read every single detail of what happened here tonight. I want them to know exactly what happens when you try to test a human border." 72 hours later, I was standing inside the high-ceiling diplomatic council chamber on the Vane Central Station. The air in the room was tense enough to cut with a blade. Sitting across from us behind an elevated obsidian desk was Delegate Threll, flanked by 6 senior commanders of the Vane Military Council. Threll slammed a glowing datapad down onto the desk. Projected above the table was high-resolution sensor footage from the raid at Outpost 7, showing the exact moment our heavy crossbow bolts had sliced clean through the Karen raiders' hardlight. "Barriers. This is an outrage." Threll's chest translator barked, his mechanical voice glitching slightly from the sheer frustration behind his words. "You have deployed weaponized projectile systems specifically designed to bypass our defense grid. You have violated the absolute spirit of the peace treaty." Colonel Hart stood beside me, immaculate in his dark gray dress uniform. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "With all due respect, Delegate," Hart replied, his voice calm and cold, "Outpost 7 was subjected to an unprovoked, illegal military assault by an armed force operating within your sovereign sector. Our garrison used non-powered, mechanical equipment to defend their lives. You used primitive ballistic instruments to butcher a modern military unit," a Vane general beside Threll snarled, leaning forward over the desk. "Those primitive instruments are fully compliant with Clause 40, I spoke up, taking a step forward and looking Threll dead in the eye. "I remember our original negotiation very clearly, Delegate. You were the one who insisted on defining restricted armament strictly by technology class. We asked you to clarify. You explicitly stated that advanced weapons meant powered energy systems, plasma cannons, and microchip-guided munitions." Threll's silver skin flushed a darker shade of gray, a clear sign of extreme physiological stress among his species. "You knew," Threll hissed. "You knew our shield architecture was optimized exclusively for high-velocity energy dispersion. You deliberately hid the fact that your species possessed kinetic mechanical hardware capable of defeating our defense grids." "We didn't hide anything," I answered flatly. "You never asked. Your council operated under the arrogant assumption that because your species abandoned primitive mechanics 5,000 years ago, every other civilization in the galaxy must have done the same. You assumed that without microchips and power cells, humanity was defenseless. You exploited a technicality." Threll shouted. "We utilized our history." Colonel Hart countered forcefully, slamming his hand onto the table. Humanity spent 10,000 years mastering the art of mechanical warfare. Every lesson our ancestors learned about tension, leverage, and raw physical mass is recorded in our archives. When you forced us to strip our modern technology, we simply reached back into our past and grabbed the tools we used before we ever learned to split the atom. The council chamber fell dead quiet. The vain generals looked at one another, their cold, unblinking eyes filled with a sudden, disturbing revelation. For 6 years, they had viewed humanity as an upstart young species that had gotten lucky with rapid industrialization. They had assumed that if you stripped away our starships and plasma rifles, we would be nothing more than soft, defenseless creatures. They were realizing the terrifying truth: humanity wasn't a young species that had rushed into high technology. We were a species of hardened survivors who had clawed our way through millennia of brutal, low-tech slaughter before we ever reached the stars. A female vain delegate sitting at the far end of the desk leaned toward her comms panel, speaking softly. Is there any electronic component within these weapons? Any software code? Any restricted power grid signature? None, a vain tactical analyst replied from the side bench, his voice hollow. We analyzed the captured bolt from the skirmish. It is constructed from forged carbon titanium alloy. It is propelled entirely by mechanical potential energy stored in a tensioned limb. Under the literal terms of Clause 40. It is classified as basic hardware, equivalent to a handheld wrench or a mechanical clamp. Thrall slumped back into his tall chair. The anger had completely drained from his face, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. So, Thrall said softly, staring at the projected video of our bowmen firing from the wall. If we demand an amendment to Clause 40 to ban mechanical tension weapons, what will your species bring to the border next? I offered him a small, polite, but thoroughly chilling smile. Delegate, I said quietly, I suggest you don't push us to answer that question. Because long before we invented the crossbow, we were killing each other with sharp pieces of steel attached to wooden poles. And I promise you, our engineers can make a very sophisticated spear. The diplomatic crisis ended not with a war, but with a quiet, official directive issued by the vain High Assembly. They did not request an amendment to Clause 40. Doing so would have required them to publicly admit to the entire Galactic Council that their multi-billion-dollar military defense grid had been rendered obsolete by wooden limbs and tension cables. Instead, the vain quietly recalibrated their military border protocols, pulling their aggressive patrol skimmers back an additional 50 miles from human space. Outpost 7 remained fully operational, its walls bristling with high-tension catapults, repeating crossbows, and carbon fiber ballistas. 2 months after the assembly meeting, I was back at the Mars orbital shipyard, overseeing the production of our secondary defense shipments. Grace walked into my office carrying an encrypted data slate, an amused expression on her face. You're not going to believe who just sent us an official trade inquiry, Grace said, dropping the tablet onto my desk. I picked it up and scanned the official letterhead. It bore the golden crest of the Coalition of the Outer Reach, a powerful alliance of 3 alien species located 4 star systems away. They want to purchase manufacturing licenses? I asked, squinting at the translation matrix. For our ancestral kinetic defense systems. Word of the battle at Outpost 7 leaked through interspecies trade networks, Grace explained, leaning against my desk. The Coalition has been dealing with electronic warfare jamming from local pirate cartels for years. Their automated defense turrets keep getting blinded by ECM pulses. They realize that a mechanical ballista completely ignores electronic jamming fields. They want to buy crossbows, I said, shaking my head in disbelief. They don't just want to buy them, Ethan, Grace chuckled. They're offering us mining rights to 3 resource-rich asteroids in exchange for the engineering schematics and training manuals. They think carbon fiber longbows are some kind of secret high-level human dark art. In a way, they are, Colonel Hart's voice boomed from the doorway. He walked into the office, now wearing civilian attire, having officially retired from active military service 2 weeks prior. He looked 10 years younger, the heavy lines of stress around his eyes finally smoothing out. "Command just approved the trade contract," Hart said, smiling as he grabbed a chair. "Humanity is officially the galaxy's sole exporter of high-tech, low-technology weaponry. We've got 4 different alien embassies lining up at Sol Station, waiting to learn how to shoot a compound bow. It's ironic, isn't it?" I mused, looking out the window at the shipyard bay below, where automated assembly arms were assembling hundreds of dark carbon fiber bow frames. The Vane tried to disarm us by forcing us to give up our future. And instead, they turned our past into our most valuable export. "They assumed progress only moves in a straight line," Hart said, looking at the schematics on the wall. "They thought once a civilization invents something shiny and new, they throw away everything that came before it. They didn't understand that humans never throw anything away. We just stash it in the attic until we need it again." A year later, I stood on the high observation wall of Outpost 7. The desert wind was still cold, whipping red dust across the rocky landscape, but the frontier was quiet. Below me, on the main courtyard firing range, a fresh squad of young human recruits was practicing their marksmanship alongside a visiting delegation of Vane military observers. It was an incredible sight. 7-foot-tall silver-skinned Vane officers were standing shoulder to shoulder with human infantrymen, carefully examining the mechanical release triggers on our repeating crossbows, taking notes on lever action ratios and draw weight physics. Delegate Threll walked up the stone rampart stairs, joining me at the lookout wall. His silver skin shimmered softly in the afternoon sun. He was no longer wearing his rigid diplomatic robes, he wore a simplified travel tunic. "It is strange," Threll said quietly, his chest translator delivering his voice in a much softer tone than I had heard in the assembly halls. 6 years we spent trying to destroy one another with particle beams and plasma warheads. And now, my engineers are sitting in your mess hall, learning how to calculate arrow trajectories using chalk and slates. Simple tools bring simple truths, Delegate, I replied, looking out toward the peaceful horizon. "I have spent much time reading your species' historical archives over the past year," Threll noted, turning his unblinking eyes toward me. "Your planet's history is terrifying, Ethan. You fought thousands of wars across thousands of years using nothing but muscle, bone, steel, and wood. We weren't proud of all of it," I admitted softly. "A lot of it was dark, bloody, and senseless." "Perhaps," Threll conceded. "But it taught your species a lesson mine never learned until now." "And what lesson is that?" "That technology is a privilege, not a foundation," Threll said, looking down at the recruits hitting target blocks with mechanical precision on the range below. "My people believed that safety came from the complexity of our machines. But machines can be jammed. Power grids can fail. Circuits can burn out. And when the power dies, a civilization that has forgotten its history is completely helpless." He turned to face me, offering his silver hand. "Your people never forgot how to survive in the dark. That is what made you dangerous during the war. Not your railguns. Not your starships. But your refusal to let go of what you learned in the mud." I took his hand and shook it firmly. "We keep everything, Threll. Just in case." He let out a short, rhythmic clicking sound from his throat, a sound I had come to recognize as the Vane equivalent of a quiet, respectful laugh. "I will ensure our treaty negotiators remember that," Threll said. "For as long as our species share this galaxy." Later that evening, after the sun had dipped beneath the jagged mountain ridge and the stars blazed brilliant and cold in the desert sky, I walked down into the outpost's armory. The room smelled of machine oil, polished carbon fiber, and leather. Row upon row of sleek black repeating crossbows, carbon alloy longbows, and heavy ballista assemblies sat neatly mounted on the steel racks, waiting silently under the soft overhead lights. On the wall near the door, Captain Bishop had mounted a simple bronze plaque. It didn't list high-tech military jargon or strategic command codes. It simply carried a short quote, engraved in bold, unyielding letters, progress gives us better tools. History gives us the strength to use whatever is left in our hands. I ran my gloved hand over the dark carbon limb of a repeating crossbow resting on the nearest bench. The border was peaceful. The treaty was holding. The galaxy was learning a new kind of respect for the old ways. Some people might look at a bow and see a relic of a primitive past, a forgotten toy from an era before mankind learned to touch the stars. But standing in that armory, looking out at the vast, quiet cosmos beyond the doorway, I knew the truth. Knowledge is never truly obsolete. It just waits quietly in the dark, ready for someone to remember it exists.